He lost his family once, so when he hears the cry of a broken child, he makes a choice, one that will drag him into danger, love, and a fight he never expected. Welcome to a channel dedicated to Western tales of cowboys, love, family bonds, sacrifice, and the quiet strength between people. The lesson here: real strength is not in power, but in choosing to protect others. If this story moves you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
The August heat in the valley didn't just burn, it suffocated. It baked the Wyoming dirt into cracked porcelain and hung in the air like a heavy wool blanket. Cade Sterling pulled his Stetson lower against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, his calloused hands resting casually on his gun belt. To the half-dozen armed ranch hands watching him from the corral, the 38-year-old millionaire looked completely at ease. He was supposed to be here at the Vance Ranch to inspect a line of chestnut thoroughbreds. But Cade's instincts, sharpened by years of surviving the harshest frontiers and outliving his own grief, were screaming that something was deeply wrong. Silas Vance's compound didn't feel like a working cattle ranch. It felt like a prison. The men didn't herd, they patrolled. "Mr. Vance will be down from the main house shortly, Sterling," a massive foreman grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco into the dust. "You can wait by the water trough." Cade gave a slow, dangerous nod. "I'll take a walk to stretch my legs. It's been a long ride." Before the foreman could object, Cade turned his back on the corral and walked toward the perimeter of the property. The air smelled of dry rot and sulfur. As he passed a dilapidated, sun-bleached barn sitting on the far edge of the tree line, he stopped dead in his tracks. It was a sound so faint the wind almost swallowed it. A thin, reedy whimper. It wasn't a sick calf or a trapped fox. A man who had once buried his own infant daughter never forgot the sound of a child in pain. Cade's gray eyes narrowed. He glanced over his shoulder. Vance's men were distracted by a restless stallion, moving with a predatory silence that defied his broad-shouldered frame. Cade slipped into the shadows of the barn's overhang. A heavy, rusted iron padlock secured the sliding double doors. Wrapping his leather-gloved hand around the lock, he used the heavy iron barrel of his Colt .45 to smash the mechanism. The brittle metal shattered with a sharp crack. He slid the door open just enough to slip inside, plunging into the stifling, windowless dark. The heat in here was suffocating, smelling of old hay and sickness. As his eyes adjusted, his breath hitched in his chest. Tucked into the farthest corner, curled into a tight, trembling ball, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dress was smeared with grime, her blonde hair matted with sweat. But it was the heavy iron chain shackling her fragile ankle to a support beam that made a cold, murderous fury ignite in Cade's blood. "Hey," Cade whispered, his deep voice dropping to a gentle rumble he hadn't used in years. He holstered his weapon and sank to one knee. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm going to get you out of here." He reached out to touch the rusted chain. Suddenly, the unmistakable click of a revolver hammer cocking echoed in the dead quiet. A cold steel barrel pressed hard against the base of his skull. "Don't move a single muscle, you bastard," a woman's voice hissed from the shadows behind him. Her voice was trembling, but the threat was deadly serious. Beneath the grit and panic, Cade detected the sharp, educated clip of a Boston accent. "I don't know who Silas pays you to be," she continued, her breathing ragged, "but if you touch one hair on her head, I will scatter your brains across this floor." Cade didn't panic. In one fluid, lightning-fast motion, he dropped his shoulder, pivoted, and struck her wrist. The gun clattered into the hay. Before she could scream, Cade grabbed her waist and pinned her back against the wooden wall, his hand clapping firmly over her mouth. She fought him like a wildcat, her emerald eyes blazing with absolute terror and defiance. She was young, dressed in the modest dust-covered clothes of a governess, but there was nothing meek about the way she thrashed against his grip. "Listen to me," Cade growled, his face inches from hers. I don't work for Silas Vance. I came to buy horses, and I just found her. If you shoot me, neither of us gets this child out of here alive. Nod if you understand. The woman glared at him, searching his hardened, scarred face. Slowly, she stopped fighting and gave a stiff nod. Cade lowered his hand, though he didn't step back. Before either could speak, the heavy thud of boots sounded outside. "Hey, the barn door's open, check inside!" a voice yelled. They were out of time. Cade drew his Colt, positioning his body between the woman and the barn door. But as he did, he felt a weak tug on his denim pant leg. He looked down. The little girl had dragged herself forward. She still didn't make a sound, her large, haunted eyes locking onto Cade's. With a trembling, dirt-streaked hand, she reached up and pressed something cold and hard into his palm. Cade opened his hand. It was a broken piece of silver, half of a cracked locket. A sharp gasp broke the tension. The woman stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached into her own collar and pulled out a silver chain. Dangling from it was the exact matching half of the locket. "Lily!" the woman choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes as she dropped to her knees. She looked up at Cade, the fierce defiance replaced by desperate vulnerability. "I'm Tessa. I'm her aunt. She's been missing for a year." Cade looked from the matching silver pieces to the woman's tear-streaked face. The puzzle clicked together. She was an Easterner, walking into a lion's den to save her blood. "Stand back," Cade ordered. He aimed his revolver at the iron link holding Lily's chain to the beam. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, shattering the iron and echoing across the entire ranch. "So much for slipping out quietly," Tessa yelled over the ringing in her ears. "Grab her!" Cade shouted. Tessa scooped the fragile, mute child into her arms, holding her tight against her chest. Cade kicked the barn doors wide open, stepping out into the blinding sunlight with his gun raised. Two of Vance's men were already running toward them, rifles drawn. Cade didn't hesitate. He fired twice, kicking up the dirt at their feet and sending them diving for cover. He let out a piercing, two-toned whistle. From the corral, his massive black stallion reared up, kicked open the flimsy gate, and thundered across the yard toward them. "Get on!" Cade barked, lifting Tessa and Lily onto the saddle before swinging up behind them. He grabbed the reins, wrapping one strong arm securely around Tessa's waist to keep them anchored. "Hold on to me," Cade commanded. His chest pressed against her back as bullets began to whiz past them, splintering the barn wood. Tessa buried Lily's face in her shoulder and gripped Cade's forearm like a lifeline. With a fierce shout, Cade spurred the stallion. They burst through the perimeter fencing, riding hard into the blinding, swirling Wyoming dust, leaving Silas Vance's men far behind in the chaos. The ride across the unforgiving Wyoming plains was a blur of pounding hooves, swirling dust, and the relentless, beating sun. Tessa Montgomery clung to the waist of the stranger who had just saved her niece, her muscles screaming in protest with every jarring stride of the massive black stallion. Pressed between the hard, unyielding wall of Cade Sterling's back and the fragile, trembling body of Lily in her arms, Tessa felt a chaotic mix of absolute terror and profound relief. She had found her. After a year of dead ends, forged letters, and the agonizing grief of losing her sister, she had finally found Lily. Tessa looked down at the little girl secured against her chest. Lily's eyes were squeezed shut against the wind, her small hands gripping Tessa's dusty bodice with a white-knuckled desperation. She hadn't made a single sound, not when the gunshots rang out, not when Cade had hauled them onto the horse, and not now as the arid wind whipped her matted blonde hair. The silence terrified Tessa more than the bullets had. "Keep your head down!" Cade's deep voice rumbled over his shoulder, vibrating through the solid expanse of his chest. "We're crossing the ridge. We'll be exposed for a mile." Tessa pressed her cheek against his rough canvas jacket, smelling the sharp scent of gunpowder, worn leather, and the honest sweat of a man who worked his own land. It was an intoxicating, overwhelming scent, so entirely foreign to the refined parlors of Boston she had left behind. An hour later, the jagged horizon gave way to a sprawling valley. Nestled against the base of the imposing Bighorn Mountains sat the Sterling Ranch. It wasn't just a cattle operation, it was a fortress. High, thick timber fences bordered the inner compound. Armed men patrolled the perimeter with rifles resting casually, yet purposefully, in the crooks of their arms. At the center stood a massive two-story house built of dark river stone and heavy pine logs, looking as immovable as the mountains behind it. As the stallion thundered through the main gates, Cade pulled back on the reins. "Lock it down!" he bellowed to his men before the horse had even come to a full stop. "Double the watch on the southern ridge. Nobody rides within a mile of this property without a rifle pointed at their chest. If you see Vance's men, you don't ask questions. You fire warning shots, and if they keep riding, you drop them." "Yes, boss," a chorus of hardened ranch hands replied, scrambling into action. Cade dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size. He reached up, his large, calloused hands spanning Tessa's waist to lift her down. For a fraction of a second, as her boots hit the dusty earth, their eyes met. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, gray, turbulent, and piercingly intelligent. Tessa felt a sudden, breathless jolt shoot through her ribs, a stark contrast to the exhaustion weighing down her bones. She quickly broke the gaze, turning her attention entirely to Lily. Cade gently lifted the little girl from the saddle. Lily flinched, her body going rigid. But Cade didn't force her closer than she wanted to be. He held her with a surprising, careful reverence, as if carrying something made of spun glass. "Mrs. Garrett!" Cade roared toward the front porch. The heavy oak door swung open, and a stout, stern-faced woman in her 60s hurried out, wiping her hands on an apron. She took one look at the bruised, filthy child in Cade's arms, and the battered, defiant woman standing beside him, and her maternal instincts instantly overrode any questions. "Lord Almighty, bring that child inside this instant, Mr. Sterling. The guest room is made up. I'll fetch hot water, carbolic soap, and clean bandages." "Take care of them, Martha," Cade said, his voice dropping to a softer register. He looked at Tessa. "Go with her, wash up, eat. I have to secure the perimeter. We'll talk when the sun goes down." He didn't wait for her permission. He handed Lily over to the housekeeper, turned on his heel, and strode toward the bunkhouse, a man entirely in his element, commanding his empire. Tessa spent the next 2 hours in a haze of soap, hot water, and tears. Together with Mrs. Garrett, they bathed Lily. The child stripped off the grime of Silas Vance's barn, revealing a map of old bruises and the raw, infected ring around her ankle, where the iron shackle had bitten into her skin. Through it all, Lily did not utter a single cry. She stared blankly at the wall, her beautiful gray eyes, so like Tessa's late sister's, hollow and distant. Once Lily was finally asleep in a feather bed, bundled in a nightgown that swallowed her small frame, Tessa washed herself. She scrubbed the Wyoming dust from her skin and borrowed a simple cotton dress from Mrs. Garrett. But her mind was racing. Cade Sterling had saved them, yes, but he was a dangerous, heavily armed cattle baron. Tessa wasn't about to trade one prison for another. She needed to get Lily back east, to civilization, to doctors, to safety. As twilight painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Tessa marched down the wooden staircase and followed the glow of lamplight to Cade's study. The room was heavy with the scent of tobacco and old paper. Cade stood behind a massive oak desk, pouring a measure of amber whiskey into a glass. Without his hat and duster, he looked even more imposing. His dark hair was damp from a wash, curling slightly at the collar of his white cotton shirt, which was unbuttoned at the throat. "She's asleep," Tessa said from the doorway, keeping her chin high. Cade looked up, his gaze sweeping over her. Cleaned up, the fierce governess was strikingly beautiful, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her green eyes burning with a stubborn fire. "Good. Mrs. Garrett said the ankle is infected but manageable," he replied, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Have a seat, Miss Montgomery." "Tessa. And I prefer to stand." She took a step into the room, crossing her arms over her chest. I came to thank you, Mr. Sterling. You risked your life today for strangers, and I will be forever in your debt. But I need to ask you for one more favor. I need a wagon, a fast team of horses, and an escort to the Cheyenne train station tonight. I have money to pay you. Cade set his glass down. The sharp clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. He leaned his hands on the desk, his jaw ticking. No. Tessa blinked, caught off guard by the flat, uncompromising refusal. Excuse me, I am taking my niece home. Silas Vance will be tearing this county apart looking for us. If we stay here, we bring a war to your doorstep. The war is already here, Tessa, Cade said, his voice low and hard. You think you can outrun Silas Vance in a wagon? He practically owns the sheriff in the next 3 towns. He owns the telegraph operator. The minute you step onto a train platform, his men will put a bullet in your escort, drag you behind an alley, and take that child back. You wouldn't make it 5 miles. I am her legal family, Tessa fired back, stepping closer to the desk, her temper flaring. I can go to the federal marshals. I can prove what he did to her. With what proof? Cade countered, stepping around the desk, his sheer physical presence forcing Tessa to tilt her head up to meet his eyes. A girl who won't speak? A story from an Easterner with forged governess papers? Vance is a wealthy landowner. Out here, money writes the law. If you leave this ranch, she dies. Or worse, she goes back to that barn. Tessa's breath hitched. The reality of his words struck her like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the adrenaline of the day finally bleeding out of her. Then what do we do? She whispered, the tough facade cracking. We can't just hide here forever. Cade's expression softened, just a fraction. He reached out, his rough thumb lightly brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek that she had missed while washing. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. You stay here, he said, his voice a gravelly murmur that made her heart race. Behind my fences, with my men. I know Vance. I know how he operates. He's going to make a mistake, and when he does, I'm going to bury him. But until then, Miss Montgomery, you and Lily are under my protection. And what is mine, I protect. Tessa looked up into his stormy eyes, realizing with a terrifying certainty that the greatest danger she faced in Wyoming might not be Silas Vance's bullets, but the quiet, devastating gravity of Cade Sterling. The nights at the Sterling Ranch were a different kind of wilderness. Outside, the coyotes howled their lonely songs to the moon, and the wind rattled the heavy window panes. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It had been 4 days since they fled the Vance compound. 4 days of forced proximity, of stolen glances across the dinner table, and of a simmering, unspoken tension between Tessa and Cade that seemed to draw all the oxygen from the room whenever they occupied the same space. But it was the nights that were the hardest. On the 4th night, the scream never came, but the thrashing did. Tessa jolted awake in the armchair she had pulled next to Lily's bed. The little girl was tangled in her sheets, her back arched, her hands clawing desperately at her own throat as if trying to rip off an invisible collar. She was trapped in a night terror, her eyes wide open but seeing only the horrors of the barn. "Lily! Lily, wake up, sweetheart! It's Aunt Tessa! You're safe!" Tessa pleaded, reaching out to grasp the child's flailing arms, but Lily fought her. In her panicked state, Tessa's hands were Silas's hands. The child kicked and twisted, her face contorted in a silent, agonizing scream. Tessa felt tears of helplessness burn her eyes. She was a trained nurse. She knew how to set bones and stitch wounds, but she had no medicine for a broken soul. The bedroom door opened quietly. Cade stood in the threshold wearing only dark trousers, his broad chest bare, a 6-shooter gripped loosely in his right hand. He had clearly come running at the sound of the struggle. Seeing the situation, he holstered the gun on the bedpost and moved across the room with slow, deliberate steps. "Step back, Tessa," he murmured. "She's terrified," Tessa sobbed quietly. "She doesn't know where she is." "I know. Let me." Cade didn't reach for the girl immediately. He knelt beside the bed, making himself smaller, keeping his hands visible and open. He didn't speak the high-pitched, frantic words of comfort Tessa had used. Instead, he began to hum. It was a low, steady, rhythmic sound, the same deep vibration he used to calm a panicked, wild Mustang caught in a barbed wire fence. "Easy now, little bird," Cade rumbled, his voice a physical weight in the room, grounding and solid. "You're in the fortress. The walls are thick. The locks are heavy. Nothing comes through that door without my say-so. Breathe the air. It's clean." Slowly, miraculously, Lily's thrashing began to subside. Her frantic, unseeing eyes zeroed in on Cade's calm, weathered face. She recognized him. The man who broke the chain. The man who brought the horse. With a small, shuddering gasp, Lily went limp. She didn't reach out for Tessa. Instead, she uncurled her small fingers and grasped the edge of Cade's large, calloused hand, anchoring herself to his strength. Within minutes, her breathing evened out, and she slipped into a genuine, exhausted sleep. Tessa stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the millionaire rancher sit perfectly still on the floor, afraid to move and wake the child. "How did you do that?" Tessa whispered, awe and a deep, aching gratitude warring in her chest. Cade gently untangled his hand from Lily's and stood up, running a hand through his messy dark hair. The moonlight caught the silver scars scattered across his shoulders. "Animals and kids," he said softly. "They don't listen to the words. They listen to the heartbeat underneath them. Yours was racing. Mine wasn't." He looked at Tessa, really looked at her. In her simple white nightgown, with her dark hair falling in disarray around her tear-stained face, she looked painfully vulnerable. The fierce, gun-toting governess was gone, replaced by a woman carrying the weight of the world. "Come on," Cade said, gesturing toward the door. "She'll sleep till dawn now. You need something stronger than tea." Tessa followed him down the dark hallway, intending to go to the kitchen. But as she passed the last door on the right, a draft caught it, swinging it open a few inches. The moonlight spilled onto the hardwood floor, illuminating the room inside. Tessa stopped. The room was perfectly clean, free of dust, but completely frozen in time. A hand-carved wooden crib sat in the center. A rocking chair rested by the window, a faded quilt draped meticulously over its back. On the dresser sat a silver brush and a small, delicate pair of infant booties. It was a nursery, a tomb. Tessa reached out, her fingers lightly touching the doorframe. Before she could step back, Cade was behind her. She expected him to be angry, to slam the door shut and lock his secrets away. Instead, he just stood there, his presence a heavy, warm wall against her back. "Her name was Sarah," Cade said, his voice sounding rusted, as if he hadn't spoken the name aloud in a decade. "And my wife was Clara, winter of '74. The fever came through the valley faster than a prairie fire. The doctor was 3 towns over, snowed in. By the time I dug my way through the drifts to get him, it was too late." Tessa closed her eyes, feeling a profound, shattering sorrow for this hard, unyielding man. She turned around to face him. He was staring into the nursery, the ghosts of his past haunting his stormy eyes. Without thinking, driven by an instinct older than words, Tessa reached out and rested her hand flat against his bare chest, right over his heart. Beneath her palm, she felt the steady, powerful rhythm he had used to calm Lily. "I'm so sorry, Cade," she whispered. Cade looked down at her. His hand came up, wrapping around her wrist, his thumb pressing against her racing pulse. For a long, agonizing moment, the air between them thickened. The boundary between protector and protected blurred. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He leaned down, just a fraction of an inch, his eyes dropping to her lips. Tessa's breath caught. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his gravity. But then Cade abruptly dropped her wrist and stepped back, clearing his throat, pulling the mask of the hardened rancher back into place. "Go to sleep, Tessa. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." The next morning, the fragile intimacy of the night before was shattered by a chilling discovery. When Tessa came downstairs to the main parlor, she found Lily sitting cross-legged on the large stone hearth of the unlit fireplace. The child's hands were covered in black soot. She had taken a piece of cold charcoal from the ash bucket and was furiously drawing on the smooth, flat stones of the fireplace surround. "Lily, what are you doing, sweetie?" Tessa asked gently, approaching slowly. Cade entered the room from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, stopping short when he saw the mess. But as he looked closer, his eyes narrowed sharply. He set the coffee down and crouched beside the girl. "Tessa, look at this," he commanded. Tessa knelt beside him. Lily wasn't just scribbling. She was communicating. The drawings were chaotic, aggressive strokes of black, but the images were unmistakable. On the left stone, she had drawn a massive wall made of logs and dirt, blocking a flowing river. Behind the wall, the water was pooling, dark and deep. Below the wall, the riverbed was cracked and empty, littered with the skulls of cattle. "A dam," Cade muttered, his mind working furiously. "There's no dam on the Elk River. Not legally." But it was the drawing on the right stone that made Tessa's blood run cold. Lily had drawn a man's arm, and wrapping around the forearm, drawn with meticulous, terrifying detail, was a serpent with its jaws open. Tessa gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. "My sister, Emma." When the sheriff sent me the report about her stagecoach accident, he mentioned a witness, a man who claimed the horses bolted. The report noted the man had a distinct snake tattoo on his arm. Cade's expression turned utterly lethal. He looked from the drawing of the dam to the drawing of the snake. The pieces fell into place with a horrifying clarity. "Silas Vance has a snake tattoo on his right forearm," Cade said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register. "He didn't just lock her in a barn to be cruel, Tessa. He's damming the river to bankrupt the valley. And he murdered your sister to get control of Lily's land to do it." Lily finally stopped drawing. She dropped the piece of charcoal. Her soot-stained hands reached out, grabbing the sleeves of Cade and Tessa's shirts, pulling the two adults closer to her. She looked at them, her gray eyes clear and desperate, silently begging them to understand the truth she had carried alone for so long. Cade slowly stood up. The man who had gently hummed a child to sleep the night before was gone. In his place was the Wyoming cattle baron, a man who knew how to wage war. "Vance isn't just a thief anymore," Cade said, pulling his Colt from its holster and checking the cylinder. "He's a dead man." By the fifth day, the Wyoming sun stopped being merely hot and became an act of sheer violence. It hung in the cloudless, bleached white sky like a forged iron coin, baking the Sterling Ranch until the ground split open in jagged, thirsty fissures. The Elk River, the lifeblood of the valley and the primary water source for Cade's sprawling cattle empire, had been dwindling for weeks. But that morning, it hadn't just receded, it had died. The riverbed was nothing but a winding scar of baked mud and smooth stones, baking in the relentless heat. From the front porch of the main house, Tessa watched the shimmering heat waves distort the horizon. The air was so dry it scraped the back of her throat with every breath. Out in the paddocks, the desperate, lowing sounds of thirsty cattle created a grim symphony of suffering. Cade had been awake since 3 in the morning. He and his men were engaged in a brutal, desperate war against nature, attempting to manually pump and haul water from the ranch's deep emergency reserve wells. It was grueling, back-breaking labor. Tessa refused to stay inside. She had spent the morning helping Mrs. Garrett tear old bedsheets into strips to dip in cool water for the men's necks. But by noon, she couldn't stand being a spectator any longer. She tied her dark hair back with a piece of twine, rolled up the sleeves of her borrowed cotton blouse, and marched out into the blinding glare of the yard. When she reached the main well, the scene was one of organized desperation. Dust coated everything, turning the men gray like ghosts. Cade was at the center of it, his shirt discarded hours ago. His broad back and heavily muscled shoulders gleamed with sweat, a patchwork of old silver scars catching the harsh sunlight as he threw his entire weight onto the heavy iron pump lever. Over and over he drove the lever down, forcing the stubborn water up from the deep earth to fill the massive wooden troughs. He looked dangerous, he looked unbreakable, and watching the raw, primal power of him, Tessa felt a sudden sharp flutter in her stomach that had absolutely nothing to do with the heat. "Let me take the bucket line," Tessa said, stepping up beside a ranch hand who looked ready to collapse. Cade froze mid-pump. He wiped his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand and glared at her, his eyes striking against his dirt-streaked face. "Get back in the house, Tessa. It's over 100 degrees out here. This isn't a Boston tea parlor." "I'm aware of my geography, Mr. Sterling," Tessa shot back, her chin lifting in that defiant way he was quickly learning to recognize. "I'm also a trained surgical nurse who has worked 12-hour shifts in unventilated wards. I can carry a bucket of water. Your men are dropping. Let me help." Cade stared at her. He expected her to wilt under his gaze. But the fierce Easterner held her ground, her green eyes flashing with an unyielding iron will. He clenched his jaw, battling the overwhelming instinct to wrap her in velvet and lock her away where the world couldn't bruise her. But looking at her fierce, proud stance, he realized she would hate him for it. "Fine," Cade grunted, pointing a calloused finger at her. "But you keep a wet cloth on your neck, and if you start seeing spots, you sit down in the shade. Am I understood?" "Perfectly," she retorted, already grabbing 2 heavy wooden buckets. For the next 4 hours, Tessa worked side by side with the hardened cowboys of the Sterling Ranch. The work was brutal. The heavy oak buckets splintered against her palms, and the coarse rope handles bit into her skin. The sun beat down on her shoulders like a physical weight, soaking her blouse in sweat and coating her skin in a layer of fine red dust. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, and her hands throbbed with a fiery, stinging agony. But she didn't stop. She hauled water to the desperate, thrashing horses. She carried pails to the calves. Every time Cade threw a harsh, calculating glance her way, expecting her to quit, Tessa met his eyes and lifted another bucket. She wasn't just surviving, she was proving herself. And Cade, hauling water 20 feet away, felt something profound shift in his chest. He had known women who were beautiful, and he had known women who were tough. But he had never known a woman who possessed both a fiery, educated mind and the raw, stubborn grit to bleed into the dirt beside him without a single complaint. She was magnificent. By the time the sun finally began its slow, bloody descent behind the Bighorn Mountains, casting long purple shadows across the compound, the immediate crisis had been managed. The troughs were full, the animals were quieted, and the men collapsed in the shade of the bunkhouse. Tessa leaned against the wooden slats of the corral, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was utterly exhausted. Her whole body trembled, and her hands were curled tightly into fists, hidden in the folds of her skirt to conceal the fact that the skin on her palms had been rubbed raw and bleeding. "You're shaking," a deep, rough voice said. Tessa looked up. Cade was standing in front of her. He had put his shirt back on, though it hung unbuttoned over his chest. In the fading twilight, his features were cast in shadow, making his gray eyes look impossibly intense. "I'm just catching my breath," Tessa managed to say, though her voice was hoarse. Cade didn't argue. He reached out and gently took her wrists. Tessa hissed, trying to pull away out of instinct, but his grip was firm. Slowly, with a surprising, devastating tenderness, he uncurled her clenched fingers. In the dim light, the damage was obvious. Blisters had formed and broken across her soft palms, leaving the flesh raw, angry, and weeping blood. Cade's jaw tightened so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He looked from her bleeding hands up to her face. "You didn't say a damn word." "You needed the water hauled," she whispered, her throat tight. "I have 20 men to haul water, Tessa. You tore your hands to pieces." The anger in his voice wasn't directed at her, it was directed at himself for letting her do it. "Come with me." He didn't let go of her wrists. He led her away from the corral, past the main house, and into the quiet, dim sanctuary of the tack room attached to the stables. The air inside smelled of worn leather, saddle soap, and sweet alfalfa. Cade pressed gently on her shoulders, guiding her to sit on a low wooden bench. He moved to a shelf, striking a match to light a small kerosene lantern that bathed the small room in a warm golden glow. He fetched a basin of clean water from a barrel, a clean linen cloth, and a small tin of beeswax and medicinal salve. He knelt on the dirt floor in front of her. His large frame took up all the space in the cramped room, trapping her in a cocoon of his presence. He took her right hand, resting it carefully on his knee. "This is going to sting," he murmured, his voice a low, rumbling vibration. "I'm a nurse. I know," she breathed. He dipped the linen into the water and began to clean the dirt and dried blood from her torn palms. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the rough, violent world he commanded. Every stroke of the cloth sent a jolt of electricity shooting up her arm. Tessa looked down at the top of his dark head, watching the careful, focused way he tended to her. "You didn't have to prove anything to me today, Tessa," Cade said quietly, not looking up as he scooped a measure of the pungent salve from the tin. "Yes, I did," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "You look at me and you see a fragile Easterner. You think I don't know how to survive. I needed you to know that I won't break just because the world gets hard." Cade paused. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes met hers in the golden lamplight, heavy with an emotion that stole the breath straight from her lungs. "I don't think you're fragile, Tessa," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I think you're the strongest damn thing I've ever seen, and that terrifies me." "Why?" she breathed, leaning forward just a fraction. "Because," he murmured, his thumb lightly stroking the uninjured back of her hand, "when you care about something strong, you start believing it might actually stay." The air between them vanished. The heavy, oppressive heat of the day was replaced by a different kind of fire. Cade's gaze dropped to her lips. Tessa's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest, smell the intoxicating scent of leather and rain on his skin. He leaned in. He was so close she could feel his breath ghosting over her cheek. She closed her eyes, her good hand lifting instinctively to grip the unbuttoned edge of his shirt. "Boss!" The sudden, frantic shout from the stable aisle shattered the silence like a gunshot. Cade jerked back, his eyes flashing shut for a second as he exhaled a harsh, frustrated breath. He stood up instantly, the hardened rancher dropping back into place like a steel curtain. A young ranch hand, covered in dust and panting heavily, appeared in the doorway of the tack room. "Boss, I'm sorry, but Deke just rode in from the North Ridge. He says the Elk River isn't just drying up from the heat. He rode up into the gorge. He says the water is being stopped." Cade's entire demeanor shifted from tender to lethal in a heartbeat. He looked at Tessa, the memory of Lily's charcoal drawings flashing between them in the dim light. The wall, the dry river, the snake. "Saddle my horse," Cade ordered the boy, his voice cold and flat. He looked back at Tessa, his eyes burning with a dark, dangerous promise. "Stay inside the house tonight. Lock the doors." The Wyoming dawn was the color of bruised iron when Cade stepped out onto the porch the next morning. He was armed for a war. His heavy Colt was strapped to his right thigh, a Winchester repeating rifle was clutched in his hand, and a leather bandolier of ammunition was slung across his broad chest. He had spent the night reviewing property maps in his study. Lily's charcoal drawing hadn't just been a child's nightmare. It was a map, a terrifyingly accurate depiction of the northern gorge that fed the entire valley. And that gorge sat squarely on the 400 acres of land that belonged to Lily's late mother, Tessa's sister, Emma. "I'm coming with you." Cade stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and turned. Tessa was standing in the doorway. She wasn't wearing Mrs. Garrett's oversized cotton dresses today. She wore a pair of men's denim trousers cinched tightly at her slender waist, a sturdy canvas shirt, and a pair of riding boots she had managed to borrow from one of the smaller ranch hands. Her dark hair was braided tight against her scalp. In her hands she held a double-barreled shotgun, breaking the action expertly to check the shells before snapping it shut with a satisfying clack. "No, you are not," Cade said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We are riding into Silas Vance's territory. If we find what I think we're going to find, there will be shooting. You stay here with Lily." Tessa walked down the wooden steps, closing the distance between them until she was staring dead center into his chest. She tilted her chin up, her green eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "Silas Vance murdered my sister for that land," Tessa said, her voice shaking with a cold, controlled fury. "He chained my niece to a barn floor like an animal. This isn't just your fight, Cade. It's my blood. If you try to leave me behind, I will steal one of your horses and follow you myself." Cade stared down at her. He saw the grief, the rage, and the absolute determination etched into her beautiful features. He knew she meant every word. She was a force of nature, untamable, and fiercely loyal. He let out a long, heavy breath, conceding defeat. "If shooting starts, you get off your horse, you get behind a rock, and you do not move until I call your name. Understood?" "Understood," she agreed firmly. They rode out within 10 minutes, leaving Mrs. Garrett and 6 heavily armed men to guard the house and Lily. The ride north into the gorge was treacherous. As they climbed higher into the foothills of the Bighorns, the landscape grew jagged and hostile. The heat of the rising sun beat down on the canyon walls, radiating off the red rock like an oven. They followed the dry, cracked bed of the Elk River. What was normally a roaring whitewater lifeline was now a graveyard of baked mud and dead fish. The silence in the canyon was unnatural, broken only by the clatter of their horses' hooves against the smooth river stones. For 2 hours they rode in tense, breathless silence, the walls of the gorge narrowing around them. And then, as they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, Cade yanked back on his reins, bringing his black stallion to a halt. Tessa pulled her horse up beside him. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Lily's drawing had not exaggerated. Straddling the narrowest point of the gorge, wedged between 2 sheer rock faces, was a massive, illegal dam. It was a brutal, ugly structure of felled timber, packed earth, and blasted rock, standing nearly 40 feet high. It completely choked off the Elk River. Behind it, a massive, unnatural reservoir of deep blue water had formed, flooding the upper canyon. Below it, the valley was dying of thirst. "My God," Tessa breathed, staring up at the sheer scale of the theft. "He's stealing an entire river." "Not just stealing it," Cade said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. He dismounted, his boots hitting the dry riverbed. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. "He's weaponizing it. Silas isn't a cattle rancher. He's a land speculator. By damming this river during a drought, he's bankrupting every ranch south of here. My ranch, the Miller place, the old Jenkins spread. Give it another month and the bank will foreclose on all of us. Vance will buy up the entire county for pennies on the dollar." Tessa swung down from her saddle, her boots crunching on the dry stones as she walked up beside him. She looked at the massive wall of timber, her mind racing back to the letters her sister had sent before her death. "Emma wrote to me," Tessa said, her voice hollow with grief. She said Silas had offered her a fortune for her land after her husband died. She refused to sell. She said this gorge was the most beautiful place in the world, and she wanted to keep it for Lily. Tessa's hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white. He killed her. He rigged that stagecoach accident so he could become Lily's guardian. All of it. The murder, the torture, the chain in the barn. It was all to control this piece of rock and a river. Cade turned to her. He saw the tears spilling over her lashes, tracing tracks through the dust on her cheeks. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He stepped close, wrapping his large, warm hand around the back of her neck, pulling her forehead to rest against his chest. "I'm going to kill him, Tessa," Cade promised, the words rumbling deep in his chest, an oath sworn in blood and dust. "He's going to hang, or he's going to bleed, I swear to you." Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, leaning into his solid, immovable strength. For the first time since she received the telegram about her sister's death, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of the tragedy alone. They spent the next hour scouting the dam, staying hidden in the rocks. Cade noted the guard patrols. Silas had a dozen armed men stationed on top of the dam, confirming this was a heavily guarded, coordinated operation. They couldn't blow it up today. They needed dynamite, and they needed men. The ride back to the Sterling Ranch was faster, driven by adrenaline and the setting sun. Shadows stretched long and dark across the plains. By the time they reached the safety of Cade's fortified fences, twilight had painted the sky in deep purples and blacks. They led the exhausted horses into the dimly lit stables. The scent of hay and leather enveloped them. As Cade unsaddled his stallion, the heavy silence between them crackled with an electric, undeniable tension. The shared danger, the revelation of the truth, and the raw vulnerability of the day had stripped away the last of their defenses. Tessa hoisted her saddle onto the wooden rack. When she turned around, Cade was right there. He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't step back. He dropped his hands to her waist, his grip firm and possessive, and backed her gently against the rough timber wall of the stable. Tessa's breath hitched, her hands flying up to rest against his chest. The heat radiating from his body was intoxicating. "Cade," she whispered, her voice trembling, her green eyes wide and searching his face. "I can't stop thinking about you," he rasped, his eyes dark, dropping to her mouth. "Since the second you put that gun to my head in the dark. I try to walk away from you and my boots won't move." Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs. She slid her hands up, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "Then don't walk away," she breathed. Cade groaned, a low, primal sound that sent a shiver straight down her spine. He brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was explosive. It was a collision of desperation, fear, and a burning, undeniable hunger. Cade's lips were firm, demanding, sweeping away any lingering doubts. Tessa kissed him back with equal ferocity, her body pressing flush against the hard, muscular wall of his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off her feet, his tongue sweeping over her lower lip, tasting of dust and rain and raw, unfiltered desire. It was a kiss that promised protection, a kiss that promised a future. For a long, breathless minute, the world outside the stables ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his mouth, the bruising grip of his hands on her hips, and the frantic beating of their hearts. Slowly, reluctantly, Cade pulled back just an inch. He rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily, the air between them thick and charged. "Tessa," he whispered, his thumb brushing over her swollen lower lip. "When this is over." He didn't get to finish the sentence. From the direction of the main house, a loud, unnatural splintering of wood echoed across the yard, followed immediately by the sharp, terrifying crack of a rifle shot. Cade and Tessa froze. The romantic haze shattered instantly, replaced by a spike of pure, freezing terror. Cade drew his Colt in a flash of silver, his eyes wide. Tessa grabbed her shotgun from the stable wall, her heart dropping into her stomach. They rushed out of the barn doors and stopped dead in their tracks. The massive, heavy oak front door of the Sterling Ranch house, the fortress Cade had sworn was impenetrable, had been blown completely off its hinges. It lay splintered on the porch. Smoke drifted from the dark, gaping entryway. And from inside the house, piercing the twilight silence, came a sound that made Tessa's blood run cold. It was Mrs. Garrett screaming, "Lily!" Tessa shrieked, breaking into a frantic sprint across the yard. Cade was right beside her, his gun raised, sprinting toward the nightmare that had just broken into his home. Silas Vance hadn't waited for them to come to the dam. The war had just crossed their threshold. The distance between the stables and the main house was less than 50 yards, but to Tessa, sprinting through the gathering dark with a shotgun in her hands, it felt like 50 miles. The acrid smell of gun smoke and blasted timber hung heavy in the Wyoming evening air. Beside her, Cade moved like a shadow detached from the night itself. His Colt was drawn, his jaw locked in a terrifying mask of lethal intent. The fortress had been breached. His sanctuary, the place he had sworn to keep Tessa and Lily safe, had been violated. They hit the porch steps at a dead run, boots crunching over the splintered remains of the heavy oak front door. Cade didn't hesitate. He went in low and fast, sweeping the entryway with his revolver. Tessa followed, her finger resting perfectly over the double triggers of the scattergun. The parlor was a scene of absolute suffocating chaos. Furniture had been overturned. The heavy Persian rug was bunched and stained. Backed into the far corner of the room, near the stone hearth where Lily had drawn her charcoal maps, was Mrs. Garrett. The stout housekeeper was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, wielding a heavy iron fire poker like a broadsword. Tucked fiercely behind her voluminous skirts, trembling like a trapped rabbit, was Lily. Standing between them and the doorway were three men. Two were unfamiliar, hired guns with filthy dusters and drawn revolvers. But the third man made Cade's blood turn to ice. It was Judd, a young, quiet ranch hand who had ridden for the Sterling brand for 3 years. Judd, who had eaten at Cade's table. Judd, whose hands were currently shaking as he aimed a Winchester repeater straight at Mrs. Garrett's chest. Silas Vance had found the boy's price. "Drop the poker, you old bat, and hand over the brat," one of the hired guns snarled, stepping forward. "Vance wants the girl alive, but he didn't say nothing about you." "Over my dead body, you unwashed bastard," Mrs. Garrett spat, swinging the iron poker in a vicious arc that forced the man to jump back. "Drop your weapons," Cade roared from the threshold, his voice shaking the timber beams of the ceiling. The three men spun around. The element of surprise was the only advantage Cade and Tessa had, and they used it violently. Before the first hired gun could raise his pistol, Tessa pulled the right trigger of the shotgun. The deafening boom echoed off the stone walls in a concussive wave. The buckshot caught the man square in the chest, lifting his boots off the floor and throwing him backward over a shattered mahogany end table. He didn't get up. The second thug fired wildly toward the doorway. The bullet shattered a kerosene lamp on the wall, raining glass down on Cade's shoulders. Cade didn't even flinch. He leveled his Colt and fired a single perfect shot. The bullet struck the man between the eyes, dropping him instantly to the floorboards in a heap of dirty canvas and blood. Suddenly the parlor was deathly quiet, save for the ringing in their ears. Only Judd remained. The young traitor was panicked, his eyes darting frantically between Cade's smoking Colt and the bloody bodies of his accomplices. He was backed into a corner, trapped. Driven by sheer blind terror, Judd swung his Winchester away from Mrs. Garrett and aimed it directly at Tessa, whose shotgun was still recovering from the recoil. "Don't move, boss!" Judd screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I'll shoot her, I swear to God, I'll cut her in half!" "Judd, lower the rifle," Cade commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadly rumble. He kept his Colt aimed steadily at the boy's heart. "You've made a mistake. Don't make it your last one." "Vance gave me $1,000, boss. 1,000. I can buy my own land," Judd babbled, tears of panic streaking through the dust on his cheeks. "Just let me take the girl. Put the gun down or the Easterner gets it." Tessa stood completely still, staring down the dark, empty barrel of the rifle. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could see the whites of Judd's knuckles. He was going to pull the trigger. He was too scared not to. "I'm sorry, boss," Judd sobbed. The hammer fell. The rifle cracked with a blinding flash of muzzle fire. But Tessa didn't feel the impact. In a fraction of a second, moving faster than any man of his size should be able to, Cade threw his massive body across the space between them. He hit Tessa like a freight train, shoving her violently out of the line of fire. The sharp, sickening sound of lead tearing through flesh echoed in the room. Cade hit the floor hard, taking Tessa down with him to protect her from the fall. A harsh, breathless grunt escaped his lips. He rolled, instantly bringing his Colt up, and fired twice. Both bullets caught Judd in the chest. The traitor dropped the rifle and slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, dead before he fully settled. Silence slammed back into the room, thick and suffocating, smelling of burnt powder and copper. "Cade!" Tessa scrambled to her knees, her hands frantically searching his body in the dim, smoke-filled light. He was pushing himself up onto his left elbow, but his right arm hung uselessly at his side. His breath was coming in sharp, ragged hisses. High on his right shoulder, just inches from his collarbone, a dark, spreading stain of crimson was blossoming across his canvas shirt. "I'm all right," Cade ground out through gritted teeth, his face pale beneath his tan. Check Lily." But Lily was already there. The little girl had scrambled out from behind Mrs. Garrett. She dropped to her knees on the blood-stained Persian rug, her small, trembling hands reaching out to hover over the terrible wound on Cade's shoulder. She looked at his face, contorted in pain, and then at the blood soaking into the floorboards. The dam inside Lily's mind, the walls built by a year of unspeakable trauma and terror, finally, violently shattered. She threw her arms around Cade's neck, burying her face in his uninjured shoulder, and a sound ripped from her throat. It wasn't a whimper. It wasn't a cry. It was a raw, agonizing, earth-shattering scream that carried the weight of 1,000 silent nights. "No!" Lily shrieked, her voice hoarse and broken, echoing through the bullet-riddled parlor. "No! Don't die! Daddy, don't die!" Tessa froze. Mrs. Garrett dropped the iron poker, her hands flying to her mouth. Cade, despite the agonizing fire burning through his shoulder, wrapped his heavy left arm tightly around the sobbing child. He pressed his face into her blonde hair. He didn't care that he was bleeding out on his own parlor floor. He didn't care about the dead men in his house. The child had spoken. She had called him Daddy. "I'm not going anywhere, little bird," Cade rasped, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on his rugged face. "I'm right here. I've got you." Tessa's medical training brutally overrode her shock. She snapped into action. "Mrs. Garrett, I need the kitchen table cleared immediately. Boil water. Bring me every clean towel we have, a bottle of your strongest whiskey, and the lantern. Move." With adrenaline flooding her system, Tessa helped Cade to his feet. He was a massive man, and leaning his weight on her slender frame nearly buckled her knees. But she wrapped her arm around his waist and guided him out of the parlor and into the sprawling ranch kitchen. They hoisted him onto the heavy oak dining table. Cade was breathing hard, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles bunched beneath his skin. "You're going to have to dig it out," Cade said, his voice tight. "I can feel it against the shoulder blade. It didn't go clean through." "I know," Tessa said, her voice dropping into a clinical, unwavering calm. She unbuttoned his blood-soaked shirt and peeled it back, exposing the raw, angry entry wound. "I've done this before, Cade, but not without ether or morphine. It's going to hurt like hell." "Do it," he commanded, his gray eyes locking onto hers. For the next hour, the kitchen became a makeshift trauma ward. Mrs. Garrett kept Lily in the corner, holding the sobbing child while Tessa went to work. Tessa washed her hands in scalding water, sterilized a pair of iron forceps in the fire, and poured half a bottle of cheap whiskey directly over Cade's open wound. Cade didn't scream. He threw his head back against the table, the cords in his neck standing out like steel cables, and let out a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards. "Look at me," Tessa demanded, her hands steady as a rock as she probed the wound with the forceps. "Cade, look at me. Keep your eyes on mine." He turned his head. His eyes, dark with agony, found her brilliant green ones. He anchored himself to her. As she worked, digging deep into the torn muscle to find the lead slug, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. He focused on the stray curl of dark hair falling across her forehead. He focused on the determined, fierce set of her jaw. "I've got it," Tessa breathed. With a sickening, slick sound, she pulled the forceps free. A bloody, deformed lead bullet clamped in the iron jaws. She dropped it into an empty tin cup with a loud clink. Cade let out a massive, shuddering exhale, his body going limp against the wood. Tessa quickly packed the wound with clean gauze, applied the beeswax salve to stave off infection, and bound his shoulder tightly with strips of white linen. By the time she finished, her own hands were trembling. She stood at the edge of the table, covered in his blood, her chest heaving as the adrenaline finally began to crash. Cade reached up with his left hand, his large fingers wrapped around her slender wrist. He pulled her gently but firmly forward until she was standing between his knees, leaning over him. "You saved my life, Boston," he whispered, a tired, breathtakingly handsome ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You took a bullet for me," she whispered back, a tear finally escaping and sliding down her cheek. "You took a bullet for a child who isn't even yours." "She is now," Cade said fiercely, his thumb brushing away her tear. "And so are you, if you'll have me." Tessa leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of him. Sweat, whiskey, blood, and the undeniable truth of a man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. "I'll have you," she swore into the quiet kitchen. "Forever." But as they held each other in the dim light of the lantern, unaware of the sun slowly beginning to rise over the jagged Wyoming mountains, neither of them knew that Silas Vance's true trap had not yet been sprung. The bullets had failed. Tomorrow, the law was coming. The dawn broke over the Bighorn Mountains like a spilled cup of dirty water, casting a pale, grayish light over the Sterling Ranch. The air was dead, thick with the heat of the unbroken drought and the lingering metallic tang of the night's bloodshed. Cade had refused to sleep in a bed. Despite Tessa's furious medical objections, he had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in a heavy leather armchair on the front porch, a Winchester resting across his lap, his wounded shoulder tightly bound beneath a clean shirt. He watched the horizon with the terrifying stillness of an apex predator waiting for the brush to rustle. Tessa sat on the porch steps a few feet away, a woolen blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. Inside, Lily was finally asleep in Mrs. Garrett's bed, exhausted from the emotional rupture of speaking her first words. The boys buried the bodies past the southern ridge. Deke, Cade's loyal foreman, reported as he walked up to the porch, removing his hat. He looked at Cade's bandaged shoulder with grim concern. "We double-checked the perimeter. Nobody else breached the fence. But boss, Judd, I never saw it coming." "Vance preys on weakness, Deke," Cade said, his voice like grinding stones. "Judd wanted his own land. Vance gave him a shortcut. It's done." "What's our next move?" Deke asked. "We know about the dam. We ride up there, blow it to hell, and string Silas up from the nearest cottonwood?" "Yes," Cade said softly. "But not today. Today, we wait to see how Vance reacts to his assassins not coming back." They didn't have to wait long. As the sun cleared the eastern peaks, a plume of dust rose on the road leading to the main gates. Cade stiffened, standing up despite the sharp flare of agony in his shoulder. He thumbed the hammer of his Winchester. Tessa stood up beside him, her heart dropping into her stomach. But it wasn't a mob of hired guns riding wildly toward the ranch. It was an organized, methodical procession. Leading the group of 6 riders was Silas Vance. He was dressed immaculately in a dark broadcloth suit sitting atop a magnificent gray gelding. He didn't look like a man who had just ordered an assassination in the dead of night. He looked like a wealthy, respectable landowner out for a morning ride. But it was the men riding beside him that made the blood freeze in Tessa's veins. They wore the crisp, dark coats and gleaming silver star badges of the United States Federal Marshals. "Hold your fire!" Cade barked to his men, who had suddenly appeared from the bunkhouse, rifles raised and aimed at the approaching riders. "Do not shoot a federal marshal unless you want the U.S. cavalry burning this ranch to the ground by Tuesday." The procession halted at the edge of the porch. Silas Vance looked at the splintered remains of the front door, then at Cade's bandaged shoulder. A sickening, perfectly polished smile spread across Silas's face. "Morning, Sterling," Silas drawled smoothly. "Looks like you had a rough night. A little trouble with the hired help?" "You're trespassing, Vance," Cade rumbled, stepping to the edge of the porch, towering over the men on horseback. State your business, or my men will put enough lead in you to sink a riverboat. The man riding next to Silas spurred his horse forward a half-step. He was a thick-necked, ruddy-faced man with a silver star pinned to his lapel. Marshal Higgins, a man known throughout the territory to be deeply in the pockets of the wealthy cattle barons. "Lower the rifle, Sterling," Marshal Higgins commanded, his voice dripping with false authority. "I'm here on official federal business." Higgins reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of heavy parchment bearing the seal of the territorial judge. "I hold in my hand a warrant for the arrest of one Tessa Montgomery," Higgins announced, his eyes sliding over to Tessa. "Charged with the kidnapping of a minor grand larceny and impersonating a governess to commit fraud against the estate of Silas Vance." The world seemed to stop spinning. Tessa felt the air vanish from her lungs. She looked at the piece of paper in the marshal's hand, the sheer audacious evil of the trap finally becoming clear. Silas hadn't just sent assassins to kill them. He had laid the groundwork for a legal checkmate. "That is a lie," Tessa said, her voice shaking with outrage. "I am the child's aunt. He murdered my sister to get control of her land, and he chained that little girl to a floor like a dog." "A tragic delusion," Silas sighed, shaking his head with mock pity. "Marshal, this woman is clearly unstable. My niece has been suffering from a wasting illness. I hired this woman as a nurse, and instead she stole my ward and my family heirlooms in the dead of night. She manipulated Mr. Sterling into harboring a fugitive." "It's a forged warrant signed by a bought judge," Cade snarled, his grip on the Winchester turning his knuckles white. "You're not taking her anywhere, Higgins." The clicking of 20 rifle hammers echoed across the dusty yard as Cade's men took aim at the marshals. The tension snapped taut like a wire about to break. One sudden movement, one loud noise, and the Sterling Ranch would become a slaughterhouse. Marshal Higgins didn't flinch. He knew exactly what cards he was holding. "Think very carefully, Cade," Higgins said softly. "You pull that trigger, and you're not just a rancher defending his property anymore. You're a cop killer. You're an outlaw. The federal government will seize this ranch. They will freeze your accounts. And when you hang, who do you think the court will give guardianship of that little girl to?" Higgins pointed a thick finger at Silas. "Her legal uncle. You shoot me, Sterling, and you hand the kid right back to him wrapped in a bow." Cade stopped breathing. The trap was perfect. It was a steel cage with no door. If he fought, he died, Tessa died, and Lily went back to the barn. If he didn't fight, they took the woman he loved away to be thrown in a territorial prison, or worse, to be quietly murdered by Silas's men along the road before she ever saw a judge. Cade's eyes burned with a helpless, violent rage. He looked at Silas, memorizing the smug satisfaction on the man's face. Then slowly, agonizingly, Cade raised his Winchester. "No." Tessa stepped in front of Cade. She pushed the barrel of his rifle down with her bare hands. She turned to face him, her back to the lawman. Her green eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears. But her jaw was set in stone. "You can't save her from a jail cell, Cade," Tessa whispered, her voice cracking. "If you do this, we lose everything. We lose Lily. You promised me you'd protect her." "I promised I'd protect you," Cade choked out, his voice breaking. He reached out with his uninjured arm, gripping her waist so tightly it hurt. "Tessa, don't do this. I won't let them take you. I'll kill them all. I don't care." "I care," she sobbed, pressing her hands against his chest. "I won't let you hang for me. Lily needs you. She finally spoke, Cade. She called you Daddy. You are her father now. You have to stay here." "Tessa." Cade's voice was a shattered, desperate plea. The unbreakable millionaire cattle baron looked entirely broken. "Time's up, Miss Montgomery," Marshal Higgins barked, dismounting from his horse with a heavy pair of iron shackles in his hand. "Step off the porch." Tessa took a deep breath, closing her eyes for one agonizing second to memorize the smell of Cade, the heat of his skin, the safety of his arms. She pulled away from him. It took every ounce of physical strength she possessed to break his grip. She turned around and walked down the 3 wooden steps into the dust of the yard. She held her head high, her spine ramrod straight, refusing to give Silas Vance the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She held out her wrists, the heavy iron cuffs clamped shut around her delicate skin with a loud, final clack. The sound echoed like a death knell in the quiet morning. "A wise decision, Miss Montgomery," Silas murmured, as Higgins led her toward a barred prison wagon that had rolled up behind the riders. "The territorial prison is very accommodating to women. I'm sure you'll find the stone floors quite refreshing in this heat." Tessa stopped at the back of the wagon. She looked over her shoulder, past Silas, past the corrupt lawmen, and locked eyes with Cade. He was standing on the porch, a towering monument of suppressed violence and grief. Blood was beginning to seep through his fresh bandages, staining his shirt red again. "Keep her safe," Tessa called out to him, her voice ringing clear and fierce across the yard. "Keep her safe, Cade, and finish him." Cade didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The vow was written in the storm of his gray eyes. Tessa climbed into the stifling, dark back of the prison wagon. The heavy iron door slammed shut, sliding the deadbolt home. As the driver cracked the whip and the wagon began to roll away, kicking up a cloud of Wyoming dust, Tessa pressed her face against the iron bars. She watched the Sterling Ranch grow smaller and smaller in the distance, praying to a God she hoped was still listening, that she hadn't just said goodbye to the love of her life forever. Back on the porch, Cade watched the wagon disappear over the ridge. The silence that fell over the ranch was deafening. "Deke," Cade said, his voice dropping an octave, devoid of any warmth or mercy. It was the voice of the Reaper. "Yeah, boss?" Deke asked quietly, stepping up beside him. "Saddle every able-bodied horse we have. Send riders to the Miller Ranch and the Jenkins spread. Tell them the dam is real and Silas Vance built it." Cade turned around, his eyes cold and dead. "We aren't going to court. We're going to war." The interior of the prison wagon was a suffocating, windowless oven of iron and heavy timber. The August sun beat down on the metal roof, turning the small, barred enclosure into a roasting tin. Every jolt of the wooden wheels over the rutted, baked Wyoming earth sent a jarring ache up Tessa's spine. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony in her chest. She had left Cade bleeding on the porch. She had left Lily. Tessa sat on the rough wooden bench, her wrists chafed raw by the heavy iron shackles binding her hands. Up on the driver's bench, separated from her by a thick iron grate, Deputy Pike was whistling a tuneless melody, occasionally cracking his whip over the team of draft horses. Marshal Higgins and Silas Vance had ridden ahead toward town to prepare the judge and the gallows, leaving the dull-witted, cruel deputy to transport the hysterical Easterner. It was a fatal miscalculation. Silas Vance had underestimated Tessa Montgomery from the moment she arrived in the territory, and he was about to pay for it. Tessa closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to slow. She was a surgical nurse. She knew anatomy. She knew how the human body reacted to trauma, to heat, and to panic. She looked at the iron chain connecting her cuffs. It was roughly 8 inches long, just enough slack. She waited until the wagon hit a particularly brutal stretch of rocky trail, the sound of the iron-rimmed wheels masking her movements. Then Tessa slid off the bench and collapsed onto the filthy floorboards. She began to thrash. She kicked her boots violently against the wooden walls, letting out a series of choked, guttural gasps, perfectly mimicking the terrifying onset of a grand mal seizure brought on by heat stroke. "Hey! Shut up back there!" Deputy Pike yelled over his shoulder, striking the iron grate with the butt of his whip. Tessa didn't stop. She arched her back, her heels drumming a frantic rhythm against the floor, her breath hitching in ragged, terrifying wheezes. She forced her eyes to roll back, allowing a thin line of saliva to slip from the corner of her mouth. "Damn it," Pike muttered. The wagon lurched to a sudden halt. Dust billowed up through the floorboards. Pike couldn't deliver a dead prisoner. Vance needed a public trial to legitimize his claim on Lily and the land, and a corpse would raise too many questions. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. The iron deadbolt on the back door slid back with a loud clack. The heavy door swung open, letting in a blinding shaft of sunlight. Pike leaned in, his revolver holstered, a canteen of water in one hand. "Listen here, you crazy—" Pike never finished the sentence. The moment the deputy's head crossed the threshold, the seizing woman vanished. Tessa coiled her legs under her and launched herself forward like a coiled rattlesnake. She threw her arms up, bringing the heavy iron chain connecting her cuffs directly up and under Pike's chin, catching him squarely across the throat. Pike let out a strangled gag, dropping the canteen as his hands flew up to claw at the iron, biting into his windpipe. Tessa didn't hesitate. She twisted her body, using her own momentum and gravity to drag the heavy deputy forward, slamming his head brutally against the iron doorframe. Pike's eyes rolled up, and he crumpled to the dirt like a sack of grain. Tessa fell with him, her lungs burning, adrenaline surging so violently her hands shook. She didn't waste a second. She frantically patted down Pike's vest until her fingers brushed cold metal. She yanked the iron keyring from his belt. It took her 3 agonizing, trembling attempts to fit the key into the cuffs, but finally, the mechanism clicked. The heavy iron bracelets fell away into the dust. She grabbed Pike's holstered revolver, checking the cylinder just as Cade had taught her, and shoved it into the waistband of her skirt. She unhitched the fastest-looking horse from the wagon team, ignoring the saddle, and mounted bareback. Tessa didn't ride back toward the Sterling Ranch. That was exactly what Silas would expect. Instead, she dug her heels into the horse's flanks and turned north, toward the jagged peaks of the Bighorns. There was an old, isolated mining outpost 15 miles away. A place Cade had mentioned had a direct telegraph line to the territorial capital in Cheyenne. She rode like a woman possessed. The wind tore the pins from her hair, sending dark waves whipping behind her. The sun blistered her face and arms, but she felt none of it. Her mind was a singular, burning blade of purpose. She had to summon the state cavalry. She had to bring a force of undeniable, uncorrupted law down on Silas Vance before Cade got himself killed. Meanwhile, miles away at the Sterling Ranch, the quiet was shattering. Cade stood in Lily's bedroom. He had changed his bloody shirt and strapped on a heavy leather gun belt holding 2 Colt revolvers. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. Lily sat on the edge of the bed. She wasn't crying anymore. She looked up at him with those haunting gray eyes, completely understanding what he was about to do. Cade knelt in front of her, ignoring the fiery agony in his bandaged shoulder. He reached out and gently tucked a stray blonde curl behind her ear. "I have to go away for a little while, little bird," Cade rumbled softly. "I have a promise to keep, to your Aunt Tessa and to you." Lily reached out and grabbed the lapel of his duster. Her small knuckles were white. "You come back," she whispered, the words gravelly from years of disuse, but fierce and commanding. "Daddy, come back." Cade's chest tightened so hard he could barely breathe. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I swear it on my life. Mrs. Garrett is going to lock the doors. You stay away from the windows." He stood up, turning his back on the only piece of his heart he had left, and walked out. The front yard of the Sterling Ranch looked like a military encampment. Deke had ridden hard, and the valley had answered. Over 30 men were mounted on horseback, weather-beaten, desperate ranchers who had watched their cattle die of thirst for weeks. Miller, Jenkins, and their ranch hands sat in their saddles, armed with rifles, shotguns, and a burning, righteous fury. Cade walked out onto the splintered porch. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried across the silent yard like the rumble of an approaching storm. "Silas Vance took my woman this morning," Cade said, the words echoing off the timber walls. "He bought the marshals. He bought the judge. And up in the northern gorge, he built a dam that is starving your cattle and killing your land. He plans to bankrupt every man in this yard and buy your blood for pennies." A low, angry murmur rippled through the mounted men. Horses stamped their hooves in the dust. The law isn't coming to help us, Cade continued, pulling his Winchester from the scabbard of his black stallion. The law belongs to the highest bidder. So today, we become the law. We ride to Vance's compound. We take back what's ours, we blow that dam to hell, and we remind Silas Vance what happens when you corner desperate men. Cade swung up into the saddle. He looked over the posse of hardened cowboys. We don't stop until his empire is ashes. Ride! With a deafening roar, 30 riders spurred their horses forward. A massive cloud of Wyoming dust rose into the sky, rolling across the plains like a tidal wave of vengeance, heading straight for the Vance compound. Silas Vance's compound was built to project wealth and intimidation. Surrounded by a high adobe wall and guarded by a dozen well-paid mercenaries, it was a monument to his unchecked power. But intimidation only works on men who still have something to lose. Cade's posse hit the compound not like a group of men, but like a force of nature. They didn't stop at the gates to parley. From 200 yards out, Deke and Miller raised their rifles and fired, shattering the wooden sign above the gate and sending the perimeter guards diving into the dirt. "Breach the gate!" Cade roared over the thunder of hooves. 2 cowboys rode hard toward the heavy timber gates, tossing a bundle of dynamite tied with a short fuse. They wheeled their horses away just as the explosives detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive fireball ripped through the dry afternoon air, blowing the heavy wooden gates completely off their iron hinges and sending a shockwave of dust and splintered wood across the courtyard. Before the smoke could even clear, Cade Sterling charged through the breach on his black stallion, his revolvers blazing. The compound erupted into absolute chaos. Silas's hired guns, accustomed to intimidating unarmed farmers, were entirely unprepared for a coordinated assault by 30 battle-hardened ranchers fighting for their very survival. Gunfire crackled like deadly popcorn. Bullets chewed through the wooden water troughs, shattered the windows of the luxurious main house, and kicked up geysers of dirt. Horses whinnied and reared in panic. Men shouted, taking cover behind wagons and barrels. Cade rode through the center of the storm, his face a mask of lethal concentration. He fired with deadly precision, dropping 2 mercenaries who tried to draw a bead on Deke. Despite the burning, tearing agony in his right shoulder, Cade's hands were steady. He was a reaper in a dust coat. From the second-story window of the main house, Silas Vance watched his empire crumble. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced his arrogant facade. He realized, with sudden, terrifying clarity, that his money and his bought badges couldn't stop a bullet. Cade Sterling wasn't trying to arrest him. Cade Sterling was here to erase him from the earth. Silas sprinted to his heavy iron safe. With trembling, frantic hands, he spun the dial, yanked the heavy door open, and pulled out a thick leather satchel. Inside were the forged land deeds, the falsified guardianship papers for Lily, and the ledgers detailing his bribes to the federal marshals. It was the paper trail of his entire criminal existence. He had to destroy it. If the ranchers did not kill him, and the state authorities somehow got involved, these papers would hang him. Clutching the satchel to his chest, Silas slipped out the back door of the main house, using the chaos of the shootout in the front yard as cover. He sprinted toward the furthest edge of the property, toward the dilapidated, sun-bleached barn where he had kept Lily chained for a year. It was isolated, filled with dry hay, and completely out of the line of fire. But Cade saw him. Through the swirling dust and black powder smoke, Cade caught a glimpse of Silas's dark suit slipping into the shadows of the old barn. A terrifying, predatory calm washed over Cade. He holstered his revolvers, dismounted his stallion, and grabbed his Winchester. "Deke, keep them pinned down!" Cade shouted over the din of gunfire. "Vance is mine!" Cade stalked toward the barn, his boots heavy against the baked earth. By the time he reached the heavy, splintered double doors, the same doors he had broken open days ago, smoke was already billowing from the cracks in the wood. Silas had taken a kerosene lantern, smashed it against the stacks of dry winter hay, and thrown the leather satchel of forged documents into the center. The old, desiccated wood of the barn caught fire with terrifying speed. Flames licked up the walls, turning the interior into a suffocating orange hellscape. Cade kicked the door open and stepped into the inferno. The heat was instantaneous and blinding, singing his eyelashes and sucking the oxygen from his lungs. Through the wall of smoke, he saw Silas standing near the back, watching the leather satchel burn. "It's over, Vance." Cade's voice cut through the roar of the flames, cold and absolute. Silas whipped around, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unhinged fury. He drew a silver-plated derringer from his vest pocket and fired blindly through the smoke. The bullet grazed Cade's ribs, tearing through his canvas duster. Cade didn't even flinch. He racked the lever of his Winchester, but before he could fire, a burning timber from the loft above gave way, crashing down between them and sending up a blinding shower of sparks. Silas used the distraction to lunge. He tackled Cade around the waist, driving his shoulder directly into Cade's fresh bullet wound. Cade let out a raw, guttural roar of agony as his right arm went completely numb. The Winchester clattered to the dirt floor. Silas, fighting with the desperate strength of a cornered rat, scrambled on top of Cade, his hands closing like a vice around Cade's throat. "You should have stayed out of my business, Sterling." Silas spat, his face contorted in a mask of soot and rage, pressing his thumbs into Cade's windpipe. "You and that Eastern bitch, you ruined everything!" Cade couldn't breathe. Black spots danced at the edge of his vision. The roar of the fire grew deafening, the heat blistering the skin on his face. But as he looked up into the eyes of the man who had tortured Lily, who had murdered Emma, and who had taken Tessa, a primal, unstoppable surge of adrenaline flooded his system. Cade brought his heavy left fist up in a brutal, bone-shattering uppercut. The blow caught Silas squarely under the jaw. The sickening crack of bone echoed even over the fire. Silas was thrown backward, collapsing into the dirt, spitting blood and teeth. Cade rolled over, coughing violently, sucking in the scorching, smoke-filled air. He pushed himself to his knees, his right arm hanging uselessly, his chest heaving. The roof of the barn was groaning, the support beams failing one by one. They had seconds before the entire structure collapsed. Silas groggily reached for his fallen derringer in the dirt. His fingers brushed the silver handle. Suddenly a clear, piercing sound cut through the chaos of the ranch. A cavalry bugle. The sharp, brassy notes echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the thunderous, rhythmic pounding of 100 horses moving in perfect unison. "Drop your weapons! By order of the governor of Wyoming, lay down your arms!" A booming voice echoed over a megaphone in the courtyard. The state cavalry had arrived. Silas froze, his hand hovering over the gun. He looked toward the burning doorway of the barn. A figure stepped through the wall of smoke. It was Tessa. She was covered in dust, her clothes torn, her hair wild, but she stood tall and unyielding. In her hands, she held Deputy Pike's heavy revolver, gripped tightly in both hands, aimed directly at Silas Vance's chest. "Touch that gun, Silas," Tessa yelled, her voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority, "and I will blow a hole through you right here." Silas looked at the barrel of the gun, then up into the fierce, brilliant green eyes of the woman he thought he had discarded. He slowly raised his empty hands, surrendering. Cade pushed himself to his feet. He grabbed Silas by the collar of his expensive, soot-stained coat and dragged the broken, defeated man out of the barn. They stumbled out into the blinding sunlight of the courtyard, just as the blazing roof of the barn finally collapsed inward with a catastrophic, fiery roar. The structure that had held Lily's nightmares was completely, utterly obliterated, sending a towering plume of sparks up into the Wyoming sky. The courtyard was swarming with men in crisp blue uniforms. The fighting had stopped entirely. Silas's mercenaries were kneeling in the dirt with their hands on their heads. The corrupt Marshal Higgins was already in irons, being dragged away by a state cavalry captain. Tessa lowered the revolver. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as the adrenaline left her system. She dropped the gun into the dust. Cade shoved Silas into the waiting arms of two cavalrymen, who immediately locked heavy iron cuffs around his wrists. Cade didn't watch him get dragged away. He didn't care. He turned around. Tessa was standing 10 feet away, staring at him. He was covered in blood, soot, and sweat. He looked like a man who had just walked out of hell. "Tessa," Cade breathed, his voice cracking. She didn't speak. She closed the distance between them in 3 running steps and threw herself into his arms. Cade caught her with his good arm, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in the scent of her, feeling the frantic, beautiful beating of her heart against his own. It was the only tether keeping him grounded to the earth. "You came back," Cade choked out, his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. "You rode to the telegraph." "I told you," Tessa whispered fiercely, her hands gripping the lapels of his ruined coat as she pulled back just enough to look deep into his stormy gray eyes. "I am not fragile, and I am never leaving you again." Cade leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of smoke, salt, and absolute, undeniable victory. The world around them, the soldiers, the ruined compound, the dust, simply faded away. High above them, thunder rolled across the Bighorn Mountains. The sky, which had been bleached white and merciless for months, finally darkened with heavy charcoal-gray clouds. And as Cade and Tessa held each other in the ruins of their enemy's empire, the first heavy drops of Wyoming rain began to fall. The dynamite cracked against the canyon walls like the fist of God. Standing on the high ridge overlooking the northern gorge, Cade and Tessa watched as the massive, illegal timber wall Silas Vance had built was blown into a million splintered fragments. For a breathless second, the world was nothing but smoke and falling rock. And then came the roar. The Elk River, imprisoned for months, surged forward with a terrifying, beautiful fury. A tidal wave of white water crashed down the dry, cracked riverbed, sweeping away the dead wood and the dust, breathing life back into the starving Wyoming valley. Tessa stood close to Cade's side, the cool mist from the rushing river kissing her cheeks. The drought was over. The state cavalry had spent the last 2 weeks purging the corrupt lawmen from the county. Silas Vance was sitting in a federal penitentiary in Cheyenne, stripped of his wealth, and awaiting the hangman's noose for the murder of Emma Montgomery and a dozen counts of fraud. The forged deeds were ashes, and Lily's inheritance was finally legally secure. Cade reached out with his left arm, his right shoulder still bound tightly in a sling, and pulled Tessa against his side. The heavy, oppressive tension that had lived in his jaw for years was gone. He looked down at the rushing water, and for the first time since Tessa had met him, the millionaire cattle baron looked entirely at peace. But peace, Tessa was discovering, was a complicated thing. 2 days later, the Sterling Ranch was quiet. Too quiet. With the threat of Silas eradicated, the fortress had lowered its defenses. The armed patrols were back to being regular cowboys, herding cattle and repairing fences. Mrs. Garrett was humming in the kitchen, baking apple pies with Lily, who was shadowing the older woman like a happy, flour-dusted duckling. But between Cade and Tessa, a new, agonizing distance had grown. Tessa stood in the center of the guest bedroom, staring down at her open leather trunk. She folded a simple cotton dress and placed it inside, her hands trembling slightly. She loved him. She loved Cade Sterling with a fierce, consuming fire that terrified her. But over the last few days, as the dust settled, she had watched Cade retreat into his study for long hours. She had seen him standing on the porch at midnight, staring out at the dark plains, lost in a world she couldn't reach. Tessa was a realist. Cade had promised to protect her, and he had nearly died doing it. But protection wasn't the same as a future. She believed, with the quiet ache of a woman trying to protect her own heart, that Cade's soul was still anchored to the nursery at the end of the hall. He had loved his wife deeply. He had built this fortress to mourn her. Tessa refused to stay and be a convenient replacement, a shadow living in another woman's house. Lily was safe. She had the legal protection of the state, a massive inheritance, and a man who loved her like a father. Tessa's mission in the West was complete. It was time to return to Boston. She closed the lid of the trunk and snapped the brass latches shut. The sound echoed with a painful finality. An hour later, Deke was loading her trunk into the back of a light buckboard wagon. Tessa had chosen her departure time carefully. Cade had ridden out to the far southern pasture to inspect a herd of calves. He wouldn't be back until sunset. "You don't have to do this, Miss Tessa," Deke said quietly, leaning against the wagon wheel, his weathered face creased with genuine sorrow. "The boss, he ain't going to be the same if you leave." "He'll be fine, Deke," Tessa said, forcing a brave, fragile smile. She handed him an envelope. "Give this to him when he gets back. And tell Mrs. Garrett I'll write to Lily every week. I'll come visit when she's older." Tessa climbed onto the wooden bench of the wagon, refusing to look back at the grand stone house. "Take me to the station, Deke, please." Deke sighed heavily, clicked his tongue, and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, rolling out of the Sterling gates and onto the long, dusty road toward Cheyenne. For 5 miles, the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the wooden wheels and the mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead. Tessa stared blankly at her hands, the newly healed skin on her palms a permanent reminder of the water she had hauled, the blood she had shed, and the man she was leaving behind. Suddenly, Deke pulled back hard on the reins. "Whoa! Easy there!" The wagon skidded to a halt, kicking up a cloud of dust. Tessa grabbed the wooden bench to steady herself and looked up. Blocking the narrow dirt road, sitting atop his massive black stallion like an avenging angel, was Cade Sterling. He had ridden hard. The stallion's chest was heaving, lathered in sweat. Cade wasn't wearing his duster. He was in a simple canvas shirt, his chest rising and falling heavily. His gray eyes were locked onto Tessa, burning with a frantic, terrifying intensity. Before Deke could say a word, Cade dismounted. He ignored his injured shoulder, striding toward the wagon with long, purposeful steps. "Get down," Cade ordered Deke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Deke didn't hesitate. He dropped the reins, jumped off the wagon, and tactfully walked several dozen yards down the road, giving them privacy. Cade stepped up to the side of the wagon. He looked at Tessa, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled envelope she had left for him. He hadn't opened it. He tore it cleanly in half and let the pieces flutter into the Wyoming dirt. "Did you honestly believe," Cade rasped, his voice rough with emotion, "that I would let you just ride away?" Tessa's breath hitched. She gripped the edge of the wooden seat, fighting the desperate urge to throw herself into his arms. "Cade, don't make this harder than it is. Lily is safe. Silas is gone. My job here is done." "Your job?" Cade repeated, a dark, incredulous laugh tearing from his throat. He stepped closer, resting his hands on the wooden frame of the wagon, trapping her in his gaze. "Is that what I am to you? A job?" "You know that's not true," Tessa flared, her own heartbreak turning into defensive anger. "But I also know who you are, Cade. You're a man who built a fortress to keep the world out. I saw you looking at the horizon last night. You're still living with ghosts, and I won't stay here just to be the woman who warms your bed, while your heart is buried in the past." Cade went completely still. The anger vanished from his face, replaced by a raw, devastating vulnerability that stripped the breath from Tessa's lungs. Slowly, wincing slightly as he used his injured right arm, Cade reached up and gently wrapped his hands around her waist. He lifted her off the wagon bench and set her down gently on the dirt road, standing inches away from her. "You think I was looking at the horizon because I was missing the past?" Cade whispered, his thumbs gently stroking the sides of her waist. He shook his head, his gray eyes shining with an emotion so profound it made her knees weak. "Tessa, I was looking at the horizon because I was terrified of the future. I was terrified that a woman as fierce, as educated, and as beautiful as you could never stay in a brutal place like this with a broken man like me." Tessa opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. Cade stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. He reached up, his rough fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of her neck, tilting her face up to his. "I was a dead man walking for 7 years, Tessa," Cade confessed, his voice breaking, laying his soul completely bare under the open Wyoming sky. "My heart was a stone, but then you put a gun to my head in a dark barn, and you brought me back to life. You bled for my land. You saved my life on the kitchen table. You gave Lily her voice back." He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I don't want my quiet fortress anymore, Boston. I want the noise. I want the fire. I want you. I love you. I love you so damn much it feels like my chest is going to crack wide open." Tessa let out a shattered sob. The walls she had built to protect herself crumbled into dust. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her fingers in his dark hair. "I love you," she wept against his mouth. "I never wanted to leave. I just wanted you to want me." "I will want you until the sun burns out," Cade swore fiercely. He kissed her, right there in the middle of the dirt road. It wasn't a kiss of desperation or fear like the ones before. It was a kiss of absolute certainty. It was a promise of forever, sealed under the boundless blue arch of the western sky. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting together. Cade reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small velvet pouch and opened it. Inside rested a breathtakingly beautiful ring. A brilliant square-cut emerald set in heavy spun gold, the color of Tessa's eyes, and the color of the Wyoming plains after a heavy rain. "I bought this in Cheyenne the day I met with the judge to finalize Silas's arrest," Cade murmured, slipping the ring onto her trembling finger. "Marry me, Tessa. Stay here. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are the only thing that matters." Tessa looked at the ring, then up into the stormy, loving eyes of her rancher millionaire. A radiant, blinding smile broke across her tear-stained face. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Cade. Take me home." 1 year later, the late August sun painted the Wyoming Valley in vibrant strokes of gold and emerald. The land, nourished by the free-flowing Elk River, was lush and alive, a stark contrast to the scorched earth of the previous summer. But the greatest transformation wasn't the land itself, it was what stood upon it. Where Silas Vance's compound had once been a fortress of cruelty, the adobe walls had been torn down. The site of the old nightmare-filled barn had been completely leveled, the ashes plowed deep into the earth. In its place stood a magnificent new building constructed of sturdy red brick and gleaming white timber. Large glass windows let in the brilliant morning light, and a bright brass bell hung in the newly painted cupola on the roof. A freshly carved wooden sign hung over the wide double doors. The Hope Valley Schoolhouse. Funded entirely by the legal leasing of Lily's underground aquifer to the territory. Negotiated by Cade to ensure the valley would never go thirsty again, the school was free for every child in Harlan County. A crowd of local ranchers, cowboys, and their families were gathered on the manicured front lawn for the dedication ceremony. Deke and Mrs. Garrett stood near the front, both wearing their Sunday best, beaming with pride. Standing on the wooden steps of the schoolhouse, preparing to cut the thick red ribbon strung across the entrance, was Tessa Sterling. She wore a beautiful day dress of deep forest green, the emerald ring sparkling on her left hand. The fierce Eastern nurse had become the most respected woman in the territory, a pillar of the community who had built a sanctuary of learning out of the ashes of a tragedy. Beside her stood Cade. He looked perfectly at ease, his dark hair catching the sun, his arm wrapped securely proudly around his wife's waist. The cold, unyielding millionaire was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes were warm and full of life. But the center of attention wasn't Cade or Tessa. It was an 8-year-old girl standing between them, holding a pair of large iron shears. Lily wore a bright yellow dress, her blonde hair braided neatly with matching ribbons. She had grown taller, her cheeks flushed with health, and the undeniable glow of a child who knew she was profoundly, unconditionally loved. The haunted, mute girl from the barn was a distant memory. "All right, sweetheart," Tessa smiled down at her, her voice thick with happy emotion. "It's all yours." Lily gripped the shears and snipped the red ribbon. The crowd erupted into loud cheers, the cowboys throwing their Stetsons into the air. Lily dropped the shears and turned around, her face breaking into a massive, gap-toothed grin. She grabbed Cade's large, calloused hand with her left, and Tessa's slender hand with her right. She looked up at the two people who had charged through fire and bullets to save her. The two people who had given her the world. "Come on, Mom," Lily shouted, her voice ringing clear and joyous across the open plains, pulling them toward the open doors of the schoolhouse. "Come on, Dad. Let's go inside." Cade looked over Lily's head and met Tessa's eyes. In that single fleeting glance, 1,000 words were spoken. They had faced the darkness, fought the devils of the West, and won. Cade smiled, squeezing his daughter's hand. "Lead the way, little bird," he said. And together the Sterling family walked out of the past and stepped into the light.